Every human being who has ever lived learned the most important things they know. Not from a book, not from a school, not from a screen, but from a story told by someone who loved them. A grandmother's voice in the evening, a grandfather's warning disguised as a tale, an elder leaning forward by the fire and saying, "Let me tell you something." This is where civilization began. Not in a library, not in a university, in the living human voice, gathering people around a fire and doing the most important thing humans have ever learned to do, making meaning together. Today we are going to explore the African storytelling tradition, one of the most sophisticated knowledge transmission systems ever developed by any civilization. By the end of this video, you will understand why Africa's griots were more powerful than its kings, why a story can outlive an empire, and why the tradition that the internet is now rediscovering has been running for 3,000 years. Let's begin. No rush. The fire is lit. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind Griot Wave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. Griot Wave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. Before we go anywhere, we need to settle what we're actually talking about. Because the phrase storytelling tradition is deceptively simple. It sounds like people used to tell stories, quaint, charming, pre-modern. That understanding is completely wrong. And it's wrong in a way that matters deeply. African oral tradition was not the primitive ancestor of writing. It was a parallel civilizational system, as sophisticated, as institutionalized, and as information-dense as any written tradition. In many respects, it was more sophisticated than writing, because it required the human body, required relationship, required presence, required response. It was an interactive, living, breathing information system. On the 5 functions, think about what institutions a society needs to function. It needs historical memory, so it knows where it came from. Legal code, so it governs conflict. Educational system, so it transmits knowledge. Spiritual guidance, so it addresses ultimate questions. Community binding, so it holds people together in shared identity. In most European societies, these 5 functions are performed by 5 different institutions: the archive, the court, the school, the church, the state. In African oral tradition, all 5 were performed by a single practice, the art of telling. That is not primitive. That is extraordinarily efficient. If you want to understand African storytelling, you have to understand one word: griot. The griot, called Jali in Mande languages, Gewol and Wolof, Okiame and Akan, Mbongi and Zulu, is the most important cultural institution in African history. More important than kings, more important than temples, more important than armies. Why more important than kings? I'm going to make a specific argument here. Kings come and go. Armies are destroyed, cities fall. But the griot remembers everything. The griot carries the knowledge that makes power meaningful. The genealogies, the precedents, the stories that say, this king has legitimate authority because his grandfather did this honorable thing. When a Mande king was crowned, the first thing that happened, before any other ceremony, was that the griot recited his lineage. All 20 generations. In public, the king's power existed only because the griot validated it, by connecting it to the past. The griot was not the king's servant. The griot was the source of the king's legitimacy. On free speech, here is one of the most extraordinary functions of the griot that is almost never discussed. The griot was the oldest protected free speech institution in Africa. The griot could say things in song and poetic form that no one else could say, criticizing the king's decisions, naming corruption, commemorating injustice, because the griot's role was sacred. To silence the griot was to silence history. No king who valued legitimacy could do that. This is Africa's oldest press freedom, encoded in the role of the storyteller. Drop in the comments. Who in your family carries the family's stories? Who is your family's griot? One of the most remarkable things about the storytelling tradition is how universal it is across Africa, despite the continent's enormous cultural diversity. Every major African society developed its own version of the specialist oral artist. Different names, different instruments, different performance styles. The same function. On the Mbongi at Mandela's inauguration. On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first democratically elected president. Before 50,000 people in Pretoria and a global television audience of hundreds of millions, the proceedings began with an Mbongi, a Xhosa praise singer, walking before Mandela, reciting his Isibongo praise poetry. The Mbongi named Mandela's ancestors, praised his suffering, foretold his greatness. This was not a folklore performance inserted for cultural flavor. This was the correct protocol. In Xhosa political tradition, the great man does not appear before the community without his praise singer announcing and legitimizing him. The 1994 inauguration, watched by the entire world, was conducted on African terms. On Asmari. The Asmari of Ethiopia are one of the most extraordinary figures in African storytelling. They are wandering artists, not tied to a court or a lineage. They travel from place to place, performing social commentary that the settled people cannot safely say. Their cultural protection means they can name injustice, mock authority, and speak uncomfortable truths. They are simultaneously the most entertaining and most politically dangerous people in any room they enter. Multiple Ethiopian governments have tried to suppress them. They survive. On the kora's sound. The kora is, in my opinion, the most extraordinary musical instrument ever made. 21 strings arranged across a calabash gourd, which acts as a resonance chamber, played with both hands using the thumb and forefinger of each hand simultaneously. The result is, you can play melody, harmony, and rhythm at the same time. The kora is a one-person orchestra. When you first hear a master kora player like Tumani Diabate, the sound is disorienting. It is simultaneously ancient and modern, familiar and completely foreign. There is nothing quite like it in any other musical tradition. This is not because it is simple. It is because it is unique, developed specifically for its function as a griot's instrument. On Sona Jabarte. Sona Jabarte is extraordinary for two reasons. First, she is from the Jabarte Griot family of the Gambia, a lineage of kora players going back generations. Second, she is a woman. In the Mande griot tradition, the kora has historically been played by men. Women griots, called Jeli Musolu, primarily sang. Sona Jabarte broke with this tradition, trained rigorously, and is now one of the most technically accomplished kora players in the world. Her choice to play the kora in public was not universally welcomed by the traditional community. She made it anyway, and in doing so, she both preserved and expanded the tradition. This is what living traditions do. They adapt while maintaining their essential character. Every culture has a founding story, a narrative so central that it defines what the culture believes about itself, what it values, and what kind of people it aspires to produce. For the Greeks, it is the Iliad. For the Romans, the Aeneid. For the Norse, the Eddas. For the Mande people of West Africa, and by extension for the entire cultural sphere that the Mali Empire produced, it is the Epic of Sundiata. On the story itself, I want to walk you through the emotional core of this story, because it is extraordinary. Sundiata cannot walk as a child. His mother is a foreign wife. The other wives mock them. He is humiliated daily. One day, a tamarind tree branch is brought to his mother, and she weeps that her son cannot even pick fruit for her. Sundiata hears this. He drags himself to where an iron rod has been driven into the ground. He grasps the rod. He stands for the first time. He walks to the tamarind tree. He tears it from the ground with his bare hands. And he lays it at his mother's feet. That scene has been told by griots to their communities for 800 years. What does it teach? That the most powerful people often appear to be the most broken. That humiliation does not determine destiny. That a mother's grief can be the catalyst for a son's greatness. These are not just literary themes. They are values that the Mande people transmitted through this story to every generation. On the oral transmission. When Jibril Tamsir Niane published a written version of the Sundiata epic in 1960, transcribed from Griot Mamoudou Kouyaté, he noted that every griot he spoke to had a somewhat different version. Different details, different emphasis, different performances. This is not a weakness of oral tradition. It is its greatest strength. Every performance is tailored to its audience and moment. The story lives because it can breathe. The palaver is one of the most underrated legal innovations in human history. It is the world's oldest, continuously practiced restorative justice system, and it is conducted entirely through storytelling. In a palaver, when a dispute arises, a land conflict, a family disagreement, an injury, the community assembles. The disputants tell their stories. Elders draw on their vast memory of precedent, told as stories, not as statutes, to offer frameworks for understanding the situation. The community deliberates, and the process continues until a resolution emerges that all parties can live with. Notice what is not present. An adversarial structure. A winner and loser. A punishment. The palaver is not designed to determine guilt and assign penalty. It is designed to restore relationship. This is exactly the philosophy that modern restorative justice, developed by Western criminologists in the 1990s, is now advocating as a superior alternative to punitive justice. Africa had it first, and it was delivered through storytelling, on praise poetry as constitutional claim. The Zulu Mbongi reciting Izabongo before a chief is not performing entertainment. They are making a constitutional argument in real time. Every name they recite, every ancestor they invoke, is evidence of the chief's legitimate authority. If the Mbongi forgets a name, or misattributes an ancestor, or recites a deed incorrectly, the constitutional claim weakens. This is why Mbongi trained for years. The poetic performance was a legal act. When Nelson Mandela's Mbongi performed at his inauguration in 1994, The audience of millions was witnessing a constitutional procedure being conducted in the oldest surviving form of African constitutional law. Mandela knew this. He stood still while it happened. He understood what was being done. Chinua Achebe said, "Proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten." In Igbo culture, and in most African oral traditions, you cannot have a significant conversation without proverbs. Not because people are showing off, but because proverbs are the most efficient way to say something important. They are compressed philosophy. On Ubuntu specifically, the Nguni phrase Umuntu Ngumuntu Ngabantu has 5 words. It contains a complete theory of personhood, a political philosophy, an ethics of community obligation, a psychology of identity, and a governance framework. Western philosophy has been working on these same problems since Aristotle, and has produced thousands of volumes. The Nguni oral tradition produced 5 words that say it more precisely. On the Sankofa. The Sankofa proverb, in its short form, go back and fetch it, paired with the Sankofa bird image, flying forward, head turned backward, holding an egg, is one of the most sophisticated visual verbal philosophical statements I have ever encountered. It addresses the fundamental human problem of temporal orientation. How do you position yourself between past and future? The answer: you carry the past's wisdom as you move toward the future. The egg the bird holds is the future, the new generation, the possibility. You carry it forward, but you navigate with backward knowledge. Drop in the comments the proverb you grew up hearing most. In any language. Let's collect them. Of all the characters in the African storytelling tradition, none has traveled further or stayed more powerful than Anansi the spider. On the origin story. The founding Anansi story is one of the most remarkable pieces of storytelling philosophy ever created. Anansi approaches Nyame, the sky god, supreme deity, owner of all things, and asks to buy all the world's stories. Nyame names a seemingly impossible price. Bring me Onini the python, Osibo the leopard, and the Momoboro hornets. Anansi catches Onini by tricking him into straightening himself along a stick to prove he is longer than the stick, then tying him. He catches Osibo by digging a pit and praising his jumping ability until the leopard jumps in. He catches the hornets by pretending to shelter them from rain in a gourd. In each case, no force, no weapons, only story. The story he tells each creature about themselves. He wins by telling them exactly what they want to hear about themselves. Anansi is the god of stories because he demonstrates what stories do. They make the teller powerful by making the listener believe. On the political meaning for enslaved people. When Anansi crossed to Jamaica in the holds of slave ships, the stories became something different. Now Anansi was not just entertaining. He was teaching. He was saying, you are in the position of the powerless, surrounded by larger, stronger forces, with all the structural advantages. Here is how you survive. Here is how you win. Not with force, with intelligence, with misdirection, with story. The plantation owners knew this. They tried to ban Anansi stories. They failed. The spider cannot be caught. One of the most important arguments for the value of oral tradition is one that scientists are only beginning to make fully. Oral traditions are scientific archives. They contain empirical observations accumulated over thousands of years and stored in the most effective long-term memory system ever developed, the human narrative. On the Dogon. The Dogon astronomical knowledge is the most famous example. Marcel Griots, the French ethnographer who studied the Dogon in the 1930s, recorded that their oral tradition contained detailed knowledge of Sirius B, the white dwarf companion to the bright star Sirius. Sirius B is invisible to the naked eye. It was only confirmed by Western telescopes in 1862. The Dogon were describing its orbital period with accuracy in their oral tradition, centuries before Western astronomy confirmed its existence. How did they know? This remains debated, but the point is, their oral tradition contained accurate scientific information. The story was the science. On geological memory, perhaps the most extraordinary finding in recent years has been the discovery that Australian Aboriginal oral traditions encode memories of events more than 7,000 years old, sea level changes as the Ice Age ended. These traditions describe specific coastal features that are now underwater, dated accurately by geological mapping. If Aboriginal tradition can preserve coastal geography across 7,000 years of oral transmission, what do African oral traditions preserve that scientists have not yet thought to ask them about? Here's the most urgent argument in this entire video. The African storytelling tradition is not just culturally interesting, it is educationally superior. I'm going to make that claim specifically and back it up. On call and response learning. Cognitive science research consistently shows that active retrieval, requiring the learner to generate information rather than receive it, is dramatically more effective for long-term retention than passive reception. When you listen to a lecture, you retain approximately 10% after 24 hours. When you actively participate in producing and recalling information, retention approaches 90%. The African storytelling tradition has always operated on active participation. The audience responds. They provide refrains. They question. Children are expected to extract lessons without being told what they are. This is not just culturally rich, it is neurologically optimal. The fireside classroom outperforms the passive lecture every single time the research is run. On night stories. The prohibition on telling certain stories except at night is one of the most sophisticated aspects of the tradition. It creates a category of sacred knowledge, knowledge that is different from ordinary daytime information. It teaches the child. Some things matter more than others. Some stories require the right context. This distinction between ordinary information and sacred knowledge is one of the most important things a person can learn. And the oral tradition teaches it through practice, not through instruction. What story did you hear as a child that you still think about? Drop it in the comments. The African storytelling tradition has two parallel streams. There is the public stream, the griot at court, the mbongi at coronation, the public storyteller at festival. This stream has received most of the scholarly attention. And then there is the private stream, the grandmother at the hearth, the mother with her sleeping children, the market women weaving commentary into every transaction. This stream is where the tradition actually lives, and it is almost entirely female-run. On Sunday Society Pedagogy. The Sunday Women's Initiation Society is one of the most sophisticated educational institutions in Africa, and one of the most underdocumented, precisely because it is exclusively female and deliberately guarded from male knowledge. During the weeks of initiation, girls are taken into the forest and educated by senior Sunday women. The education is delivered entirely through story, song, and performance. They learn ecological knowledge, what plants are medicinal, which are poisonous, social knowledge, how to manage a household, how to navigate relationships, legal knowledge, women's rights and obligations in their community, and spiritual knowledge, the cosmological understanding that grounds their identity as women. All of it, delivered through narrative. The Sunday Sowe mask, the beautiful wooden mask worn by Sunday society leaders, is the only African masquerade mask carved and worn by women. It represents the perfect woman of wisdom. The mask is the embodiment of the stories the Sunday carries. The story wears the face. On market commentary. In many West African communities, the market has historically been the primary space of political and social commentary. Women who control market trade also control the flow of information. The stories exchanged in the market, about who did what, who needs what, who has failed their obligations, constitute a parallel political system. When Igbo women organized the famous Women's War of 1929, they used the market network to coordinate 10,000 protesters across a vast region in days. The market was both the information network and the assembly. Storytelling was the technology.
Of all the formal features of African storytelling tradition, call and response is the one that has travelled the furthest, influenced the most, and is least often credited to its source. On the compact. In many West African storytelling traditions, the performance begins with a ritual compact between teller and audience. The teller calls a signal phrase. The audience responds. This is not just ceremony. It is a contract. It says, we agree to enter this story together. We agree to participate. We agree that what happens in this narrative space matters to all of us. That compact, that mutual agreement to enter a shared imaginative world together, is the foundation of all storytelling. Western literary culture has largely lost this. The author writes in solitude. The reader reads in solitude. Call and response refuses this solitude. It insists that story is communal. On the global journey. Trace the journey. West African call and response storytelling, middle passage. African American work song, call by the lead worker, response by the group. The field holler. The blues, a guitar calls, the voice responds, or the voice calls and the guitar responds. Gospel, preacher calls, congregation response. Jazz improvisation, instrument calls, other instruments response. Soul and funk, the lead singer calls, the horns or backing vocals response. Hip-hop, MC calls, sample response, or hook calls and verse response. Every pop song you've ever heard with a chorus that completes the verse. Every time you sing along to a song, every time a preacher says, "Can I get an amen?" Every time a crowd chants at a concert, you are participating in a tradition that was developed around West African fires. The structure survived everything.
I want to address a common objection to oral tradition, the idea that it is unreliable, that things get changed in transmission, that the quote telephone game effect degrades information over time. This objection is based on a misunderstanding of how oral tradition works, and modern neuroscience has effectively demolished it. on the 22x memory advantage. This figure, that narrative information is approximately 22x more memorable than abstract information, comes from cognitive science research by Stanford business professor Chip Heath and Dan Heath, and corroborates decades of work by Walter Ong, Jack Goody, and Albert Lord on the mechanics of oral tradition. The griot tradition was not a workaround for the absence of writing. It was a superior system for the specific purposes it served. On error correction, the telephone game fails because there is only one chain of transmission. African oral tradition is not a chain, it is a network. Every community member who knows the story is a node in the network. When a teller deviates, the network corrects. This is why the Sundiata epic, transmitted for 700 years across 30-plus griot generations, is recognizably the same story in every version, not identical in detail, but coherent in structure, character, and meaning. The community is the editor. On Homer, the comparison to Homer is instructive. Classical scholars now widely accept that Homer's Iliad was an oral composition, designed to be performed, not read, which is why it has the repetitions, the formulaic epithets, rosy-fingered dawn, the wine-dark sea, and the episodic structure characteristic of oral composition. The African oral tradition was not trying to be writing. It was doing something writing cannot do. It was performing. Colonial powers understood something that academic folklore studies often misses. Storytelling is dangerous. Specifically, storytelling that preserves alternative claims to authority, legitimacy, and history is a direct threat to colonial power. This is why colonial governments went to extraordinary lengths to suppress African oral traditions, and why those traditions survived anyway. On the blues as specifically African. The blues has been so thoroughly absorbed into American culture that its African origin is frequently forgotten. Let me be specific about the African elements. The 12-bar blues is built on a 3-part AAB lyric structure that mirrors the 3-part pattern of West African song. The guitar plays a call, the voice responds, or the voice calls, the guitar responds. The sliding microtonal notes of blues guitar replicate the vocal ornaments of West African singing. The personal testimony structure, I was here, this happened to me, I feel this, is the structure of West African personal narrative poetry. The blues is not American music that happens to be created by Black Americans. The blues is West African oral tradition in a new container. On Ngugi. Ngugi W. Thiong'o is one of the most important writers and theorists of our time. His argument, that writing in English is writing in the colonizer's epistemological framework, is not just about language. It is about storytelling. Who gets to tell the story? In whose language? With whose assumptions baked in? In what narrative form? When he chose to write Kaitani Mutharabaini, Devil on the Cross, in Gikuyu, on toilet paper while imprisoned by the Kenyan government, he was making the argument with his body. The story that matters most must be told in the language of those it belongs to. The Kenyan government understood the threat. They imprisoned him for it. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the Griot Wave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Don't build alone. Join the Griot Wave Inner Circle and connect with a community focused on real execution and transformation. Scan the QR code to begin. When people hear the word epic, they often think of Homer, the Iliad, or the Odyssey. Yet Africa has preserved epic traditions that are just as rich, complex, and enduring, often through oral transmission alone. The Epic of Sundiata, passed down for over 800 years, tells the story of the founder of the Mali Empire and contains every element of the classic hero's journey. The Elzidi saga unfolds over days of performance, blending drama, history, spirituality, and communal participation. The Mwindo epic explores journeys between the worlds of the living and the dead, revealing a sophisticated cosmology and moral philosophy. The Kambili epic preserves ecological knowledge alongside adventure, while the Liongo epic wrestles with themes of power, loyalty, destiny, and betrayal. What is remarkable is that these works were not preserved primarily through books. They survived through memory, performance, music, and generations of trained storytellers. They remind us that literature is not defined by ink on paper. Literature is the human art of preserving meaning, and African societies have been doing that at the highest level for centuries. These epics are not relics of the past. Many are still performed today, proving that oral literature is not a forgotten tradition. It is a living one. One of the most fascinating characters in African storytelling is the trickster. He appears in different forms across the continent: Anansi in Ghana, Eshu among the Yoruba, Hlakanyana in southern Africa, Kalulu in central and southern Africa. But the lesson is remarkably consistent. The trickster is rarely the strongest character in the story. He is often small, overlooked, or powerless. Yet through intelligence, creativity, humor, and adaptability, he succeeds where brute force fails. These stories teach that wisdom can overcome strength, that systems can be challenged, and that clever thinking is often the greatest form of power. But the trickster is more than a hero. Characters like Eshu remind us that reality is complex and cannot always be reduced to simple rules. Tricksters create confusion, expose hypocrisy, test boundaries, and reveal hidden truths. They force communities to think, rather than simply obey. What makes these stories so enduring is that they speak to a universal human experience: how ordinary people navigate power. Whether through Anansi's wit, Kalulu's cunning, or Hlakanyana's survival against overwhelming odds, the message remains the same. Your greatest weapon is not your size, your wealth, or your status. It is your mind. That is why the trickster appears across Africa in so many forms. The characters may change, but the wisdom remains. One of the most powerful myths about African oral tradition is that it disappeared when writing arrived. In reality, it transformed. It adapted, and some of Africa's greatest writers became modern-day griots, carrying ancient storytelling traditions into books, plays, and essays that reach the world. Take Chinua Achebe. Things Fall Apart is not simply a novel written in English. It is an Igbo oral tradition translated into written form, filled with proverbs, communal wisdom, and storytelling rhythms that had existed for generations. Ngugi W. Athielno took this even further. He argued that language carries culture, memory, and worldview. By choosing to write in Gikuyu, he challenged the idea that African stories needed European languages to be legitimate. Ama Ata Aidu brought oral performance into theater, using call and response, audience participation, and communal storytelling techniques that break the traditional Western separation between performer and audience. Wole Soyinka embedded Yoruba cosmology, praise poetry, and ritual performance into modern drama, proving that African oral forms could stand on the world's greatest literary stages. And Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie reminds us that the griot tradition is still alive today. Her insistence on multiple perspectives, and her famous warning against the single story, reflect one of oral tradition's deepest values. Truth is too complex to fit into a single voice. These writers did not abandon oral tradition. They carried it forward. Their books may sit on library shelves, but beneath the printed words, you can still hear the storyteller's voice, the community's wisdom, and the rhythm of stories once told around a fire. One of the most fascinating cultural journeys in history is the path from the West African griot to modern hip-hop. What many people see as a purely American art form carries deep roots that stretch across the Atlantic to centuries-old African oral traditions. Look at the parallels. The griot begins by naming lineage, family, and community. The MC introduces themselves, their burrow, their crew, and their identity. Both are declaring who they are and where they come from. The kora, or talking drum, provides the rhythmic foundation for the griot. In hip-hop, that role belongs to the DJ and the beat. Different instruments, same function, creating the space where the story can unfold. The audience is never passive. In traditional storytelling, the community responds, sings back, and completes the performance. In hip-hop, the crowd answers hooks, repeats choruses, and energizes the MC. Storytelling remains a collective act. Most importantly, both traditions preserve history. The griot records battles, leaders, triumphs, and failures through performance. Hip-hop artists, from Public Enemy to Kendrick Lamar, document the realities of their communities, becoming historians and journalists in real time. And then there is improvisation. A master griot adapts the story to the audience and the moment. Freestyle rap does exactly the same thing. It is the living, improvisational spirit of oral tradition at its most technically demanding. So when we listen to hip-hop, we are not hearing a break from African tradition. We are hearing one of its most successful global evolutions. The griot did not disappear. The griot moved from the village square to the world stage. When many people think of storytelling, they think of entertainment. In many African traditions, storytelling serves a much deeper purpose. It is a form of healing. Consider grief. In many African communities, loss is not processed in isolation. It is held collectively through story. Funeral praise poems, family histories, and communal remembrance help transform private pain into shared meaning. Story becomes a way of carrying grief together. We see this principle on a national scale in Rwanda after the 1994 genocide. The Gacaca courts relied heavily on oral testimony. Survivors spoke, perpetrators spoke, communities listened. While imperfect, the process recognized a profound truth. Healing often begins when stories are heard. What's fascinating is that modern psychology has arrived at similar conclusions. Narrative therapy, the idea that people can heal by reauthoring and reinterpreting their life stories, was formalized only recently. Yet African traditions have been practicing forms of narrative healing for generations, even centuries. Dream sharing offers another example. In many African cultures, dreams are not treated as private experiences. They are brought to the community, discussed collectively, and interpreted through shared wisdom. The story of the dream becomes a tool for reflection, guidance, and emotional well-being. The lesson is powerful. Stories are not just records of what happened. They help people understand suffering, restore identity, strengthen community, and find meaning in difficult experiences. In that sense, storytelling is not merely culture. It is medicine. One of the greatest misconceptions about African culture is that it remained on the continent. In reality, African storytelling crossed the Atlantic, survived slavery, and became one of the foundations of New World culture. In the Caribbean, Anansi stories survived for centuries. Enslaved Africans carried the clever spider trickster across the ocean, preserving not only the character, but the storytelling style, moral lessons, and community participation that surrounded him. In the United States, the Black church became a powerful home for African oral tradition. Listen closely to a sermon. The preacher calls, the congregation responds, the story unfolds, and the community discovers meaning together. This is oral tradition in a new setting. In Brazil, Yoruba and Fon traditions were preserved through candomblé communities. Songs, prayers, histories, and sacred narratives continued to be performed and transmitted despite enormous efforts to erase them. The influence is equally visible in music. Blues, jazz, gospel, hip-hop, and spoken word all carry elements of the griot tradition. Personal testimony, social commentary, improvisation, and storytelling rooted in community experience. The MC is, in many ways, a modern griot. And in Haiti, Vodou preserves some of the most complete surviving oral liturgies of West Africa outside the continent itself. Stories, songs, and sacred performances became vessels of memory and resistance. What this slide reveals is something remarkable. The Atlantic Ocean did not break the tradition. It carried it. African storytelling adapted to new languages, religions, and societies, but its core remained intact. Much of what we call New World culture today is, at its heart, African oral tradition wearing new clothes. Many people assume technology is killing traditional storytelling. In reality, it may be doing the opposite. The internet has given the ancient African storytelling tradition its largest audience in history. Think about YouTube. Griots, historians, praise singers, and storytellers who once performed for a village can now reach millions across continents. The oral tradition has not disappeared. It has gone global. The same is true of Nollywood. Behind the entertainment is a deeply African storytelling structure. Community-centered narratives, moral lessons, proverbs, family networks, and collective values. Millions watch these stories every day, often without realizing they are engaging with centuries-old traditions. Podcasting has also revived long-form oral storytelling. Across Lagos, Nairobi, Accra, and Johannesburg, creators are using voice, testimony, memory, and conversation in ways that would feel familiar to storytellers from centuries ago. Even social media reflects traditional African communication patterns. Posts invite responses. Videos spark call and response. Communities collectively interpret, challenge, and expand stories. The audience is no longer passive. It participates. The medium has changed from the village fire to fiber optic cables, but the principle remains the same. People gathering around stories to make meaning together. The griot did not disappear in the digital age. The griot simply got a smartphone. This tradition is not disappearing because it lacks value. It is under threat because the conditions that sustained it for centuries are changing faster than ever before. The first threat is language loss. When a language dies, we don't just lose words. We lose proverbs, metaphors, humor, history, and unique ways of understanding the world. Every language carries a storytelling universe within it. Urbanization has also transformed community life. The village storytelling circle, where generations gathered nightly, becomes harder to maintain when families are scattered across cities and continents. Formal education has played a role as well. For generations, many Africans were taught that knowledge was only legitimate if it was written down. In the process, the wisdom of elders was often undervalued. Today's biggest competitor may be the screen. A child who once learned stories directly from grandparents may now spend evenings on YouTube or social media. The stories may still exist, but the relationship between elder and learner can be lost. And finally, there is the problem of context. African proverbs and stories are often quoted around the world, but separated from the cultures that gave them meaning. The words survive, but the deeper wisdom is diluted. The challenge before us is not simply to preserve stories. It is to preserve the living relationships, languages, communities, and contexts that allow those stories to remain alive. After everything we've discussed, the pressures of language loss, urbanization, and cultural disruption, it would be easy to assume this tradition is fading away. But the reality is far more hopeful. African storytelling is not dying. It is adapting, evolving, and returning in new forms. Across African universities, oral literature is now being studied as a serious intellectual tradition. What was once dismissed as folklore is increasingly recognized as a foundational source of African philosophy, history, and knowledge. At the same time, preservation projects are racing against time to record the voices, songs, epics, and memories of elders before they are lost. Communities, scholars, and cultural institutions are working together to safeguard these living archives. Perhaps most exciting is the connection between the griot tradition and contemporary music. Listen closely to Afrobeats, spoken word, or conscious hip-hop, and you'll hear familiar patterns: praise poetry, storytelling, social commentary, call and response, and community identity. The griot never disappeared. The griot picked up a microphone. And beyond classrooms and recording studios, storytelling festivals across Africa continue to bring people together around the oldest human technology of all, a shared story. The revival is happening because a new generation is realizing that these traditions are not relics of the past. They are tools for understanding identity, preserving memory, building community, and imagining the future. The story is continuing, and new storytellers are stepping forward to carry it. One of the strongest arguments for taking African oral traditions seriously comes not only from the traditions themselves, but from the scholars who studied them with intellectual rigor and respect. These thinkers challenged the old assumption that literature only exists when it is written down. Chinua Achebe demonstrated that African oral traditions possess the depth, complexity, and philosophical richness found in any literary tradition. Ngugi W. Thiong'o argued that language carries culture, memory, and identity, making indigenous storytelling central to cultural liberation. Isidore Okpihho provided the scholarly foundation that established African epics as literature worthy of the same attention given to Homer and Virgil. Ruth Finnegan systematically dismantled the myth that oral literature was somehow inferior to written literature, showing its sophisticated structures, artistry, and social functions. Walter Ong went even further, revealing that oral cultures are not less intellectual than literate cultures. They simply organize and transmit knowledge differently. Together, these scholars transformed the academic conversation. Their work helped the world recognize a truth that African communities had always known. Oral tradition is not a lesser form of knowledge. It is a different, highly developed way of preserving history, teaching wisdom, and understanding the world. Throughout this presentation, we've challenged several common misconceptions about African storytelling. It is not merely entertainment. It is a system for preserving history, teaching ethics, healing communities, and transmitting knowledge. Oral traditions are not unreliable. Many have survived for centuries through highly trained custodians and community validation. They were never replaced by writing, and continue to thrive today through music, film, podcasts, and digital media. Many cultural forms often seen as uniquely American, such as blues, gospel, and hip-hop, carry deep roots in African oral traditions. And far from being anonymous, African storytelling has always celebrated master storytellers, griots, praise singers, and oral historians whose names and lineages have been remembered across generations. The evidence is clear. African storytelling is one of humanity's most sophisticated and enduring intellectual traditions. If this presentation has inspired you, these resources are the perfect next step. African storytelling is not something that can be fully understood from a single lecture or a single book. It is a living tradition best explored through multiple voices, performances, and perspectives. The books listed here provide the intellectual foundation. From Chinua Achebe and Ngugi W. Thiong'o to Isidore Okpihho, Walter Ong, and Ruth Finnegan, these authors help us understand the history, structure, and significance of oral traditions across Africa. But storytelling is meant to be experienced, not just studied. Listening to griots like Tumani Diabate and Sona Jobarte allows you to hear the tradition in action. Watching talks, documentaries, and performances reveals the rhythm, participation, and emotional power that cannot always be captured on the page. And finally, the learning resources offer opportunities to continue the journey, exploring archives, academic courses, recordings, and contemporary storytellers who are carrying these traditions into the digital age. The key lesson is this: African storytelling is not a subject to be finished. It is a tradition to be entered. The deeper you go, the more you discover a vast archive of wisdom, creativity, history, and human understanding that continues to shape the world today. Throughout this presentation, we've explored the history, wisdom, and power of African storytelling. But traditions survive because people practice them, not because people merely admire them. The good news is that becoming part of this tradition does not require special training. It begins with simple actions: learning a proverb, listening to a griot, sharing a story at a family gathering, or recording the memories of an elder. In fact, recording an elder's story may be the most important action on this slide. Every untold story that disappears is a piece of history lost forever. Notice that many of these practices are communal. African storytelling was never designed for passive consumption. It invites participation, conversation, reflection, and connection. It teaches us to listen deeply, speak thoughtfully, and trust communities to discover meaning together. If there is one challenge I would leave you with today, it is this. Before this week ends, ask an elder to tell you one story from their life. Record it, preserve it, share it. In that moment, you are not just learning about a tradition, you are helping keep it alive. If we had to distill thousands of years of African storytelling into a single framework, these 10 principles would come very close. Together, they reveal that storytelling in Africa is not simply an art form, it is a social institution. First, stories belong to the community. The storyteller is a custodian, not an owner. Second, every story serves a purpose: to teach, heal, guide, remember, or strengthen the community. Third, memory itself is treated as a living archive, capable of preserving knowledge across generations. Notice also that the audience is never passive. Listeners participate, respond, interpret, and help shape the meaning of the story. That is why the moral is rarely stated directly. The goal is not to tell people what to think, but to help them discover wisdom for themselves. Context matters. Performance matters. Voice, gesture, rhythm, and presence are all part of the story. And perhaps most importantly, storytelling connects past, present, and future. Ancestors remain part of the conversation, and stories become a community's way of preserving values, correcting behavior, healing wounds, and strengthening identity. Taken together, these principles show us that African storytelling is far more than entertainment. It is a system for transmitting culture, preserving memory, and sustaining community across generations. As we come to the end of this journey, I want to leave you with the words of Amadou Hampâté Bâ: "When an elder dies, a library burns." It is one of the most powerful statements ever made about human memory and cultural inheritance. Throughout this presentation, we have seen that African storytelling survived not because it was written down, but because it was carried in people, in voices, songs, performances, proverbs, and conversations. It survived because one generation chose to teach the next. The living word never depended on paper. It depended on relationships, on listening, on remembering, on someone taking the time to sit with a child, a student, a neighbor, and say, "Let me tell you something." Today, the responsibility passes to us. We can choose to let stories disappear, or we can become custodians of memory. We can record an elder, learn a proverb, share a family story, or pass on a lesson that shaped our lives. If there is one message to carry forward, it is this: traditions do not survive because they are old. They survive because people choose to keep them alive. The living word is now in our hands. The question is, what story will we pass on next? Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, courses, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.